Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Women in Math and STEM, where our mission is to reach out to as many professionals, aspiring professionals, students, whatever you name it. We try to reach out to them, who essentially support the initiative of bringing more women and young girls into the STEM field. So, with that being said, as always, feel free to open up the description or transcript to better follow along, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hello, and thank you so much for being able to make it to this episode and speak with me today. Just to sort of start off, do you mind briefly introducing yourself, as well as walking us through your math education journey, sort of what inspired you to pursue a career in education and advocacy for women of color in math?
Mm, awesome. Good morning. Thank you for having me. I am Dr. Colleen Hinds-Rodgers. And sorry, my voice is a little hoarse, but hopefully you can hear me okay. Wow, so that's a big question. So tell you a little bit about my journey in math. Well, I started off in none of you nor your audience is probably old enough to remember the movie Lean on Me in the late 80s, it probably was. And it centered on a high school in Paterson, New Jersey called Eastside High School. And it kind of told the story of this urban school with its typical challenges. So I grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, went to Catholic school, kind of in the shadows of Eastside High School. And I would say there's where my journey began, thinking about education. Um, Also at home, I'm a child of immigrant parents, both from the Caribbean, one who migrated here to go to law school, Fordham Law School in New York, and the other as a domestic worker. And so, unlike a lot of young girls in their early educational experiences, I would say that mine was positively affirmed, particularly in my genius in math and in STEM. Early in my education, I was kind of noted as being, super smart, got skipped a grade. And so I think about those micro and those macro affirmations. I also knew that education was a non-negotiable at home. Um, and I had parents who, for what it was worth, I wouldn't say they knew how to advocate for me, but they tried. They were engaged and active and advocated when they needed to. And so that's how I think about my early years in education. Like I said, got skipped a grade, um, was always kind of smart and quick and learned easy. So school itself wasn't a big hurdle. Behavior probably was more of a hurdle than academics. Ah, so I was that, kid with an attitude, maybe, talking back to the teachers, maybe. But luckily, we eventually migrated to southern New Jersey, in the suburbs, kind of suburbs of Philadelphia. And there, although I didn't have the language to describe it then, was my first experience with like, this is different. And so we talk about educational inequities in our system. And luckily, I was on the other side of that. So we moved to a suburban area, and there I could go to public school. Didn't have to go to Catholic school because of the quality of the urban education. I also had a Black woman as a principal. I also had Black women teachers. And despite the attitude, they saw the promise in me, right? And so when I moved to that new district, I got into a gifted and talented program in seventh grade. And so again, surrounded myself, I think friends are really important too. So I think about the friends that I kept and had access to. And so we all kind of motivated and pushed each other and went on naturally to college. Um, I could not tell you the story of why. Like I said, I typically connect it back to my parents. My father is probably who made the strong recommendation, but I decided to major in chemical engineering as an undergraduate in college. And again, for me, that was like, oh, okay, no problem. I know I'm strong in math and science, and sure, that sounds like something I should be able to do. So I did it. right? I went on to Tuskegee University in Alabama, majored in chemical engineering. While I was there, I took advantage of internship opportunities. I interned with 3M. Also, I interned with the Department of Energy in Chicago. And so those were great building blocks and experiences. I earned my degree, and then I began working in industry. My first job was at a paper mill in Memphis, Tennessee, where I was a manager as an engineer. And then after a few years there, I got a little homesick and wanted to come back up north. And so I took a job with M&M Mars, the candy company, smelling like chocolate every day. So that part was fun. But what I also realized in that work environment that it can be hostile to women, it can be hostile to women of color, and it can be hostile to young women of color in leadership positions. And it just so happened that that intersection, someone, a college friend actually, told me about this alternate route program to becoming a teacher. And although I had not thought about it previously, when I look back at it, my dad was a teacher before becoming a lawyer. I spent summers with my grandmother in Brooklyn, who was also a teacher in her home. And so I was like, oh, wow, I'm like a third generation teacher. And so I made that switch easily. I moved back home. People were like, girl, what are you doing? My mom was super supportive. And within a summer, I became a math teacher, a middle school math teacher. And I have not left that industry since. That was in 2003, so more than 20 years ago. I've been in education as a teacher, then as an administrator, um, went abroad to get my master's, came back, did more kind of teaching, administration, and eventually became a consultant, a math consultant in New York City for that district. And then full circle, um, left that company and spent 6 years working for that alternate route program that I entered in 2003, Teach for America. And so I was the national director of STEM on their teacher leadership development team for about 6 years, where we helped pre-service teachers, help to develop them. And then eventually I created my own consulting firm. So we work with districts, individuals, schools, nonprofit organizations, always with an equity lens, but because we have a background as educators, we do instructional coaching, we write curriculum, we do executive coaching with leaders to help them with their strategic action plan and making sure the results we want to be true for students are operationalized in the actions that we take every day, and the priorities that we set, in schools and districts. So that was a long story, but that is my journey in math and also how I got involved in education and consulting.
That sounds amazing. I just also was curious, sort of like from your experiences, what are some of the challenges you see like women of color or like young girls of color face in math and STEM, as well as like how exactly can we address those challenges and what your consulting firm specifically does in terms of its mission, its work, its initiatives in helping young girls develop their confidence and skills.
Yeah, I love that question. Oh, so I touched a little bit on the challenges that exist even when the narrow pipeline make it to a career as a woman in STEM. There are challenges there, right? Systemically, just about belongingness, about bias, and those things exist throughout the pipeline. But when I think about your question, I also want to touch on my doctoral scholarship is really around investigating early math trauma and how that plays into our academic identity. And so I interviewed teachers actually to learn more about their early experiences. And it turns out they're no different than anybody else. And so many of them have those early negative experiences in math, whether it's by way of their parents, socializing them, especially girls, right? That they don't belong in that space, or like it's not a problem that they don't feel strong there. Okay, lean towards humanities and liberal arts. And you also have those who experience negative experiences or trauma at the hands of teachers. feeling like they're boxed in and there's one right way. And, they struggle with like memorizing the million and one algorithms. And, they just don't feel seen. They don't feel like there's a place for them in that space. And so by middle school, going into high school, many young people have kind of concretized their identity in math, right? You hear people say, "Oh, I'm not a math person," or "I hate math." And I'm like, what in the world? So that burns my butt a little bit because I'm like, you rarely do you hear people walk around and say, "I don't read, I can't read, I hate reading," right? You'd be like, please get help, right? Especially in this day and age. But it's socially accepted that people are like, math, I hate it. And so we have to change that. And so my company works with teachers because I think that's where the problem lies, both in healing their own trauma and kind of uprooting that and making peace with that, right? Making connections between why they don't spend enough time in math, why they themselves don't understand the concepts. I think about when I got into education, I had to do a sample lesson on the Pythagorean theorem. And to be honest, I was a grown up, like I was in my 20s, and I didn't actually realize that conceptually, we are talking about when we talk about a squared plus b squared equals c squared, we just kind of take for granted and memorize that. We're literally talking about squares on the sides of a triangle and the areas of those squares that add up to be the total area of the square on the hypotenuse. And I'm like, what? Really? And so we push as we coach teachers and principals and coaches to learn and teach math conceptually because kids then are able to make connections to prior learning, to things they learned in, the early grades, and it then makes sense, right? Math is not magic. And so I think that's where it begins. It begins by kind of disrupting the cycle of trauma, and teachers have a responsibility in that for students. We have a responsibility in being more engaging, right? The curriculum and the standards, core curriculum may tell us what we need to teach, but it doesn't tell us how, right? So as we think about how do we create engaging context for the math so that it's not just like rote and boring, that stuff is important when we think about curriculum design and planning. Often teachers feel like their hands are tied, but they're really not, right? We can bring in current events. We can talk about how does math connect to reality, and make it more engaging. Also, pedagogically, I promote guided inquiry as a way to teach versus like traditional teaching of like, let me tell you how to do the problem, then you just do the problem. It's like, what? Where's the creativity? Where am I pulling on your genius and what you already know? So there's a lot of things there that I think we can change in our system. And many of the clients in the districts we work with, we're making those changes so that math and STEM are just more engaging and more realistic, and they make sense for young people. And hopefully, young people become more interested, right? And like, oh, I can do this. I feel confident. I feel competent in my abilities. And so why not pursue careers that are financially lucrative, that are engaging, that are exciting, and that you can have an impact in like solving the world's problems. And we need diverse voices. We need women. Our brain works differently. And so our voices are critical to solutions, and to humanizing the ways in which we engage our future.
I see. Speaking of like developing curriculums, I was wondering how exactly do you approach designing culturally relevant curriculums and sort of also in the grand scheme of things, like looking back, could you share like a memory of a particular like particularly memorable like project or partnership or like just core memory you have from your working experience?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that question. So culturally relevant and sustaining curriculum has been a really important leverage over the past, I'd say probably decade or so in education, as we think about the opportunities that we have, as we think about the results that we see year in and year out, and knowing that if we can't and shouldn't explain those results and that disparity, um, across lines of difference, right? Because no group is more smarter than any other group, has less genius or less confidence or willpower. None of that is true. What we know is that we need to engage students, particularly the youth culture, right? And also the changing demographics of our country. When you think about cultural diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity, all of those things, has made it really important for us to merge those two worlds. And so when I think about our work with this topic, we really love to build capacity for those who are on the ground in the classrooms every day, because that is what makes it sustainable. And so we worked for years with Ithaca School District up in upstate New York and the entire district. And so we would have professional developments and workshops with their teachers, with their leaders around building curriculum. So we helped to build their capacity in doing that skill. Before we did that, we started with development around their mindset, right? So if we just take the same people and just give them a skill like, or give them material, it doesn't change the output, to be honest. So first we have to interrogate your own personal relationships with math, your socialization around schooling, around how you see culturally diverse people. Um, and so we spent quite a bit of time starting with that work, that mindset, that heart work, how we see students and their genius, so that when we get to the skill of writing curriculum, we have a different perspective. They have a different perspective. And so that was a really rewarding and beneficial opportunity. Like I said, it takes time. It's over years, and partners have to invest in that type of partnership. And so they ended up, and they were committed to that. Like they had an initiative around learning forward and really leaning into anti-racist curriculum and how we can um, adapt and use curricular literacy to make sure we're attending to the needs of students. And so they built beautiful units of study that were then posted on their website, that they then actualized in classrooms. And we had empathy interviews with students to hear their voices about how they received it and felt about it. And so really looking at the stakeholders involved and kind of valuing those voices was rewarding both for us as kind of that partner that helped them get to that place, and for them and for students. So that was super exciting. And then I think you asked one more follow-up question. Ah, one more recent one. I'm currently working with District 4 in New York City with their assistant principals. And so similarly, I did a session around math identity, right? We think, oh, they're leaders, they're kind of course they know all the things. And so it was really powerful to have the opportunity, to give them the opportunity to unpack their early experiences as students, as kids, and how they've come to that place where, they either love or hate or kind of have this tension with math. And it really opened up their eyes and their hearts to leaning into being stronger advocates for math and for students. We talked about a jagged learning profile for students. We used to think about students as like, oh, you're a visual learner, you're an auditory learner, right? You hear those things. Kinesthetic learner. And those were great. I think that was Gardner's work, research work around multiple intelligences. But then we began putting kids in boxes. And the reality is what we know that theory has been debunked. None of us are one way. We don't learn one way. And so as we think about our jagged learning profiles, which means each of us we have a jagged learning profile. For some things, we're above average. For some things, we may just be average. And other things, we have a need, right? There's a gap in like, we may be below average on what we understand about a topic. And so that freedom to name that even though you may excel and be gifted and, have all A's, there's some things that may be confusing to you, right? Or you don't understand the first time. And that is okay. And so by thinking about our jagged learning profiles, we also open up access to students. Um, and so what that means is that like on a Tuesday morning, if you have a geometry class, you may need something different than kids, who take it after lunch, right? Or if you're learning about systems of equations, you may need a visual model of that versus if you're learning about geometric proofs, you may want a step-by-step logical, how does this work? Or you may need to hear it again. So it really changes. We're so dynamic. And so leaning into that work when we think about math, leaning out of white dominant culture when we think about one right way and urgency, like we got to get it today. Well, I may need tomorrow, right? As a kid, I might need 2 days to understand this huge topic. And so the more we can do to balance, how we show up in math classrooms, the more we can do to kind of expand that work. And so that was powerful in New York City with assistant principals because they came back and talked about how they shifted their mindsets and started doing their work differently. One school leader, she had a parent afternoon, like a math night, and began to kind of unpack with parents their journey and their experiences in math. Another, as a leader, he became more aware of how the disparity in time that he spent in ELA classrooms doing observations versus math classrooms. Right. So that shift, and I'm like, wow, that is huge. And that's on a systems level, right? It's not just affecting one classroom, but we're talking about tens and hundreds of classrooms. So super excited about that work and continuing it with principals in New York. That's coming up soon.
I see. That sounds really amazing. And then I guess, sort of to end off, I was wondering if you had any advice, tips, honestly, anything for young students, but particularly girls of color who are interested in
Yeah.
pursuing a career in math or STEM in the future.
Yeah. Ah, so I see many of them in me, right? And I'm like, I'm excited when I can be, an example. I feel like there should be many more. I will tell you about a resource I worked on with 3M in the last few years. They had a big initiative around, I think it's called Not That Science Type. And so they spotlighted girls and women in STEM. That's really powerful too. So you can feel free to share that. I'll send you the link if I can find it. But there's many organizations that really value that diversity in women in STEM. The advice I would give to young people is to like speak up, you know, be loud, ask questions, raise your hand, say, I don't get it. Can I have, can you explain it a different way? Hold teachers accountable for the learning that you need and that you deserve and that you should have. Um, take up space. Take up space. If you're one of 5 girls or 3 girls in a room full of boys, speak up. You deserve to be there. You are there for a reason. You have a different perspective, way of thinking about a solution, perhaps. Speak up and be strong in those spaces and try it. Try it out. Be curious. Stay curious, right? Look for programs that expose you to, like, we talk about engineering as this big thing. There's so many different facets of engineering. So continue to look for those things that you feel like, wow, this gives me energy. I'm super excited about. Um, I love your idea of like, if there's no programs at your school, start one. They have math leagues, they have math, outside of school that you can bring in. They have speakers willing to come and talk to you and your classmates. Yeah, look for networks and connections and do your best, right? Try to be excellent. Aim for excellence because that is undeniable. That is undeniable. Yeah, we need more of us out there. I am rooting for all the girls, all the colors. We need it. And so I am here for all of it. And we need to show up and show out and take up space. That's all I can say. Don't be ashamed to be where you are because you belong there. You belong.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. It was absolutely phenomenal talking to you and for you to
Yeah.
come and share your perspective.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. My pleasure. And let me know if you need anything else.
Sounds good. Thank you so much and have a great day.
All right, you too. Have fun at school.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.